8th of March, 2021 is soon upon us, and many teachers will be returning to school buildings to conduct classes in the traditional manner that we know so well. And although some teachers have been with key workers during this time, many have been working 100% from home, whether that is remote teaching, planning, marking, all of the work has been done in a certain way. And when we first went into lockdown all that time ago, we were in a new scenario. Anxiety, feeling unsafe, all these different things started to creep up. And as teachers return, there's now lateral flow testing. There are a lot more considerations to take into play. And one of the big questions that I've been hearing whilst coaching teachers is, how will I cope? And this could be with the additional workload of taking care of others. This could be, how do I cope with if a scenario was to occur and things began to spread? How will I cope in terms of looking after myself or the children? All of these different questions that came forward in coaching over the last week or so was very much about the question, how will I cope? So I wanted to give you a little bit of an opportunity today to delve a little bit deeper into how you can support self when these questions creep up and we start to overthink. Now, you can imagine when we ask the question, how will I cope? And we don't give an answer, we can get a bit lost and unsure. Because in reality, when we say, how will I cope? The question you next want to ask is, cope with what? Because everyone is going to be unique in terms of what makes them feel a little bit anxious, unsafe, unsure, or maybe in a scenario they've never done before or never experienced. It is normal to find yourself feeling a little bit anxious and unsure of a new scenario. That's okay. However, we want to be aware that if it is triggering us a lot, we need to give ourselves some grounding, a little bit of extra support. So the first thing I would love you to note down is, what is it that part of you is worried or concerned that you won't be able to cope with? What are you trying to cope with? Now, for a few people, just as an example, the response that was coming back was the additional workload. The teaching was okay, that's fine, been doing that for years, or potentially have been doing it for a couple of years and starting to get into the swing of things. However, the additional workload, again, we get to ask, what additional workload? Be specific. So when we are trying to support part of ourselves, we need to know where we can take action. And we don't know where to take action if we're simply asking, how will I cope? And with additional workload. What we're missing here is specificity, she says. You knew what I meant. So specificity is how I say that, is something that's really, really important. In other words, in Annabelle's language, specific. Be specific. Because when you are trying to support yourself, you need to know what you are supporting yourself in. So, for example, one teacher I spoke to was, how will I cope with the lateral flow testing? So there was a situation where part of her was saying, well, how do I cope with the lateral flow testing? I've never done it before. So once we know specifically what it is that we're concerned and anxious about, we can start to put in stop gaps. We can start to say, okay, let's get curious. And this is the important thing. We want to be curious. So let's have a look. Lateral flow testing. We've never done it before. We don't know how to do it. We have no idea. So the questions we want to find out are, how does it work? Where do I get it from? What do I do? It's these questions, how, what, where, when, which part of us is seeking an answer to. But we begin to overthink the how will I cope? How will I cope? How will I cope? And we get stuck in this area, but it's cope with what? What are you trying to cope with? Because then we can try and find a solution. So, whatever it is for you, find out specifically what is the thing you're trying to cope with, and then start to ask the questions: how, what, where, when. From there, you can start to look at your next step. So, for instance, we might say, well, how does lateral flow testing work? As a question. We might ask someone who has done it before. We might Google it and find out what it actually consists of, see if there's any videos of it happening. Maybe there is a document that has been sent out. Whatever it might be, that is where we want to start. So we want to start to look at solving these problems to feel more supported. If we had a little bit more information, that would help. So whatever it might be, we get to start to answer these questions by making them more specific. Once we have made them more specific, we can start to look at solutions. So what I wanted to talk about today is that if you are feeling anxious about going back on the 8th of March, we get to dial in a little bit more about what we are being aware of. For instance, another teacher that I spoke to has been on maternity leave throughout, and she's about to go back to work. So she's saying, how will I cope with the new baby and work? So she knows how to teach, she knows how to do that. She's been a mum for a while, but she hasn't done both at the same time. And that is when part of her starts to panic, because there's no data to pull upon, there's no experience to go by. It's a new place that part of her is in. So we want to find that next step. We want to say, okay, well, how will I cope with the new baby and work? She's being specific. That is what she wants to know. So the question then is looking at, how will I cope? It's answering that. How will I cope? So what if you had to work with the baby and work? Well, I know that the baby has feeding times. I know that I'm going to have time scheduled for planning and marking. There are certain things that we will have as a routine, which we can ensure that we lock into. So we can say, right, okay, well, these are parts of my routine that I need to pay attention to. They need to be done. Same as when I talk to teachers about self-care and saying, well, you need your break times at certain times, routine times. This also helps with your sleep and how well you sleep. All these things of taking care of self, they are things that need to happen consistently every single day in order for us to be optimum in our performance. So when we are in a scenario where we don't know something yet, it's important to make sure that you have a grounding. You have the ability to have variety, but you also have the ability to have the familiar. And we all need these in different amounts. For me personally, I love variety in life. It's what I thrive on. But for others, familiarity is more important. We all have different levels of this. Now, parts of us start to get anxious when we lose a certain element of familiar. So I often say to teachers, if you want a work-life balance, you are more looking at finding a harmony. So instead of balance, we look at harmony. This is really, really important if you want to progress and you want to be able to become stress resilient, because the more chronic stress we're under, the more we're going to be less resilient to acute stresses that might come up each and every day and make us a little bit more irritable. So the question about how will I cope, the first thing we want to look at is number one, with what? Be specific. And number two, once we're specific, start answering the questions so that you can have that new step, that new routine, so that you are able to create a structure. Now, when we ever have change, what I was talking about work-life harmony is, and variety and familiarity, is that we don't want to have too many things in our life that are unfamiliar. So we want to bring it back. When we start asking those questions, how do we bring it into the world that we're in now? So, for example, the new mum knows her baby's needs. So she knows what her baby needs in terms of a general self-care. She knows potentially what she needs, how often she needs a break, or whatever she needs to do. Um, she's also going to know in terms of what her class potentially needs in terms of structure as part of her planning. Now, when we have work and life, the key thing to remember is that we don't want to have work and life and have work varied, so variety in work, and life varied. It's too chaotic. There's too many things going on. There's too many variables. However, if, for example, life, we have a routine and work is varied, then we have a little bit more safe grounding and support in order to move forward. If, for example, work becomes routine, so once you go back and it's been a few months, you find that work is in a bit of a routine, you're finding it's okay, you're working really well, you might say, well, I want to make a life change. And I want to be more varied in my life. You might start trying new things, you might move house, whatever it might be. What we want to try to avoid is being varied everywhere where there's so many variables, the stress levels become too high. So if you are thinking about the 8th of March, overthinking about the 8th of March, and the underlying story is, how will I cope? Ensure you do those 2 steps. 1, with what? 2, answer the questions. 3, implement steps that parts of you are familiar with. Because when you start to implement those steps that parts of you are familiar with, what you're going to find is that you are able to take a little step forward, because maybe you know how to get to school and you know someone that you can ask, you know those things, they are familiar, but the varied part is the lateral flow testing. It could be that you know a certain routine and you just take parts of those routines and you start to tweak them in a different way. I like to call this tweak of the week when we're working towards a specific goal, but the idea is that you have a harmony between the things that you know are familiar to keep you feeling grounded and safe, and the variety in life that gives you a little bit of spice and allows you to feel a little bit more motivation in certain ways. So allows you to feel, if you're getting bored and you're finding things are all samey and you just want to do something different, that Groundhog Day that many people did experience was an example of that. So the key thing is, when people say, don't worry about the 8th of March, that's not important. What is important is that you are listening to yourself. I am forever a believer of listening to yourself. And if you are overthinking anything, ask the questions, whether it is that you journal, whether you decide that you want to reach out to a coach for support, whatever it might be. The key thing is, instead of ignoring what parts of you are trying to pull focus to, you need to listen to yourself. Listening to yourself, or learning to understand yourself and your needs, means that you can respond to the world around you rather than constantly reacting. All the best for the 8th. I'm sure you will be absolutely okay. And as always, please do feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I hope you found today's video useful, and please do hit subscribe and ensure that you hit the notification bell so that you can be kept up to date with all the tips and strategies that I have to avoid teacher burnout. Speak soon.